So hello and welcome to this, the fourth ramble around St Nicholas's churchyard. And I've had confirmation that somebody can see me, which is very good. I'm Jeff Richards, as I said. I'm one of the trustees of St Nicholas, the Friends of St Nicholas Churchyard, and this is one of a series of rambles as we go around the churchyard. We can't meet together, we can't be together because of the restrictions, the need to stay inside, stay at home, protect the NHS and to save lives. So we're following the orders, but to get over the frustration, the fact that we can't be here, we can't actually share each other's company, this is one of those little presentations that take us around Sutton, or at least around the history of Sutton. After all, we are living in a historic time, so let's make some time for our history. Well, I'm very grateful to the folks from the two organisations. The first is the organisation that I want to call out is actually the Sutton Civic Society. And the next society, the next group that I want to call out is actually down to Enjoy Sutton as well. The Sutton Civic Society and the Enjoy Sutton have given me great support, moral encouragement to do these presentations, and that's really great. Enjoy Sutton is an organisation that brings together more than 500 local businesses that work together to try and promote Sutton as a commercial and business and cultural centre. And the Civic Society, Sutton Civic Society, promotes civic pride and aims to inspire progressive improvement in the quality of the town's centre. Both have an important role in the life of Sutton. But I'm going to start with a quote, and really the subject, you have to understand where I've come from on this particular presentation is down to a prompting from Mr. Peter Struick, who is one of our volunteers and is a very good friend, and he suggested that we should explain why Sutton is where it is and what its relationship with water is. And I'm going to start with a quote. I'm going to be intellectual. I'm going to start with a quote from W.H. Auden. This is from his poem, First Things First. Grateful, I slept till a morning that would not say how much it believed of what I said the storm had said, but quietly drew my attention to what had been done. So many cubic meters the more in my cistern against a leonine summer. Putting first things first. Thousands have lived without love, but no one has lived without water. Thousands have lived without love, not one without water. A very profound statement from a poet that had no links whatsoever with Sutton. So I'm going to contrast that instead with a couple of rhymes that have come from the ancient sages from Sutton. And these have been recorded by the Reverend Thomas Firminger Thistleton Dyer. That's a really great name. I'm going to say that name again a little bit later on. He wrote a book in 1906 called Folklore of Women, in which he recorded the following. The Downs in the vicinity of Sutton, Banstead and Epsom, in addition to being noted for their sheep, which have given rise to various rhymes, have been in other ways equally famous, if we are to believe the following. Sutton for good mutton, Cheam for juicy beef, Croydon for a pretty girl, and Mitcham for a thief. Personally, I think that their poems smells too much of Edwardian editing, but to the Reverend Thomas Firminger Thistleton Dyer's credit, He also records a more laconic poetic version. Sutton for mutton, Carshalton for beeves, Epsom for whores, and Ewell for thieves. In these two versions of 19th century rhymes, they assess the Surrey settlements. No attempt is made to impute the character of the residents of Carshalton or of Sutton itself. The assessment of Sutton and Carshalton is purely agricultural. Sutton is known for its tasty sheep, while Carshalton is known for its fat cows. These rhymes will not have been preserved by the residents of Epsom or Ewell or Mitcham. They would have been preserved by the folk of Sutton and Carshalton. And they go to the core of what's important, that food is important, and what food was important to a community was defined by the landscape. So let's remind ourselves of the landscape. And here is a map of the parishes and manors of Sutton. Do you notice how these ancient parishes, and you can see in the centre of the map, I hope you can see this clearly, you've got everything from Epsom, Ewell, Cuddington, Cheam, Sutton, Carshalton, Beddington, and as we go on then into Croydon. But these are the ancient parishes. They're long and they're thin. They're much longer in their north-south dimension than they are in their east-west dimension. And when the Saxons divided up the land on the northern escarpment of the North Downs, if this land division actually wasn't done by the Romans, then they did this to take into account the landscape. So let's zoom in on just the geology that sits underneath that landscape. This is a superimposed map from the British Geological Survey, and you can see just a little bit of trace of the one-way system within Sutton here, but the point is that it's showing that the geology of Sutton is made up of three predominant soil types. You've got upper chalk that is in the southern parts of Sutton, so that's the light green that you can see here, and that's where we rise up to the down. You've got London clay to the northwest, and that's the grey that you can see here, and then you have river terrace sands and gravels in the lower lying area, and that's the bands, the amber and the blue band that you can see here, and the result of the changes in the height and interface of the chalk and gravel with something called the Thanet Sands is found on this north-south divide, bisecting really the parish, the manor of Sutton. It's where water goes and descends through the chalk until it hits the impermeable clay and then rises through the sand to produce springs and ponds, and these are the basis of any early settlement and farming and crops. And you've got in that narrow band that you can see there of the amber and the blue, that's the narrow zone of very, very fertile soil that has been underneath more or less continuous cultivation for thousands of years. And this is where on that band, on the escarpment of the north escarpment of the Downs, that's why you've got Beddington, Carshalton, Sutton and Cheam where they are. And that's where, because that's where the people were, that's where the churches were built. So St Mary's in Beddington is very close to the Wandle. All Saints Carshalton stands almost right on top of the ponds, and Bullins Well. You've got Bullins Well in Carshalton as well. And on the face of it, St Nicholas, Sutton and Cheam Parish Church, St Dunstan's, they don't seem to be obviously near a watercourse. Or are they? This is where we can do a little bit of detective work. So Sutton and Cheam actually have a missing stream that is called the Bourne. So the Bourne rose somewhere in what is now Cheam Park. And there's actually somewhere called Pond Hill Gardens in Cheam, and you can see that it reappeared again in Love Lane. And there's actually, in Love Lane, there used to be a pond there called the Boney Hole, or the Bonny Hole. And there were all sorts of things. If the water welled up there, it was a time of woe and national calamity, and it was also called the Woe Hole in Love Lane. So I think it's quite an interesting combination of words, the Woe Hole in Love Lane. But the Bourne flowed then towards Sutton, mostly hidden. And I think I'm right in my understanding of this, from what I've read, is that the Bourne would arise again near Gandergreen Lane, in what was an area that we can call Bourne Close, and I think there's another place which is just there called Antrobus Drive, or Antrobus Road, and the reason for this, I think, is here you've got an image that is taken from Church's Directory of Sutton in 1880, which is showing Mr. Antrobus's field, showing the Bourne water. And this Bourne, this stream, flowed again eastwards and rose once more in West Street in a place called Divers Ditch. And Divers Ditch, and we know what it was like, we know where it was, and we've got photographs of it, as you can see here, was filled in 1866. But at this point, the Bourne was supposed to flow northwards until it joined the Pill. And the Pill, well, here you've got, and what I've done here is on this map, I've actually made the watercourses that exist within Sutton itself much more obvious. So this is a modern map, and I've highlighted where the Bourne, where the Pill Brook is. And you've got two branches of the Pill. One is the Pill, the main Pill, and then you've got the East Pill that flows along Sutton Common Road. So the Pill and the East Pill flow north and join together in Rains Park, and then they eventually join what's called the Beverley Brook in Beverley Park in New Malden, and then that goes on and finally joins the Thames. But there's actually another clue to a missing watercourse, and how the two, the Bourne and the Pill, are related. And this is the idea of the Blackwater. You might have heard of a pub called the Blackwater Tavern. When I used to pile out of, when I was 17, 18, I used to pile out of the youth club. That was the Church's youth club, and with all our friends, we would then go and sit in the car park of the Blackwater and drink until we were thrown out. But the thing about the Blackwater Tavern is that it stood somewhere, well, it stood in George Street, and George Street, and you can, if you see the church on this map is from 1952, so this is an Ordnance Survey map from 1952. You've got in the bottom third where you've got St. Nicholas Churchyard, and if you look straight up from the church, you've got West Street, which was where Divers Ditch was, and then above that you've got George Street, which is where the Blackwater Tavern was, and that's where the Blackwater was. So the pub stood where the entrance to the St. Nicholas Centre multi-storey car park is now, in St. Nicholas Way, so it's been completely obliterated by the St. Nicholas Centre. There's an interesting reference that takes us way back to 1496. So it goes back right back to the time of the Abbot of Chertsey, and when St. Nicholas was owned, St. Nicholas and Sutton was owned by Chertsey Abbey. There was a chap in 1496 who rented half of some land called the Blackwater. And he was a guy called Richard Cook, and the prior of Merton Abbey held the other half of that. And the thing about the Blackwater and the Blackwater Tavern was that the Blackwater Tavern was known as an underground stream. It actually ran through the Blackwater Tavern's cellars, or underneath the cellars. And just, and I was saying about the churches being close to water, well, actually the distance between St. Nicholas Church and the Bourne, or the Blackwater at Divers Ditch, and I don't know whether we should call it the Blackwater or the Bourne, it was actually shorter than the distance between St. Mary's and the Wandle. So if you think about St. Mary's Church in Beddington, it's very, very obvious that it's close to the river because it's visible. But in terms of distance, it's actually a little bit further away than St. Nicholas stood in relationship to the underground stream, or which may have been a more visible stream when, in times of the Saxons founded the settlement in the 600s. But the problem of Sutton is not that the water is not what you would call obvious. It's not that it didn't have water, and here you can see Sutton certainly had cows, and it certainly had some water. And this is a photograph from Hallmead Farm, and Hallmead Farm is where Hallmead Road is, and is really by the green in Sutton. The mead word indicates that we've got plenty of wetness there, but it's not obvious, it's not free-flowing, it's not economically useful. And here we have actually some really interesting descriptions from historical times. So this gentleman that I'm showing you now is Daniel Defoe. He is the person who wrote, of course, Robinson Crusoe. And this is what he had to say about Carshalton. He wrote actually a tour through the whole island of Great Britain, divided into circuits or journeys. And he wrote this about between 1724 and 1727. He wrote, Carshalton, a country village situate among innumerable springs of water, which all together form a river in the very street of the town, and joining the other springs which come together from Croydon and Beddington make one stream, which are called the River Wandle. This village, seated among such delightful springs, is yet all standing upon firm chalk, and having the downs close adjoining, makes the most agreeable spot on all this side of London. Compare that with the description 100 years later by William Cobbett of Sutton. And this is William Cobbett. And he wrote a series of articles called The Rural Rides, and this description of Sutton was written in 1823. In a dell, which the turnpike road crosses about a mile on this side of Sutton, there are two fields of as stiff a land, I think, as I ever saw in my life. In summertime, this land bakes so hard that they cannot plough it, and the sun comes unless it be wet. When they have ploughed it, and the sun comes again, it bakes again. One of these fields had been thus ploughed and cross-ploughed in the month of June, and I saw the ground when it was lying in lumps of the size of portmanteaus, and not very small ones either. It would have been impossible to reduce this ground to small particles except by means of sledgehammers. The book, another book written a generation after William Cobbett's description of Sutton, called The Topographical Dictionary of England, had this to say about Sutton. It comprises 1,768 acres of land, chiefly arable, and includes some extensive downs on which between 200 and 300 sheep remarkable for their small size and superior flavour, are annually reared. So Sutton was dry with sheep, and Carshalton is wet with cattle. And there is a factoid that I can share with you that explains the different water needs for cows and sheep. A pregnant ewe consumes something like, well, up to 6.5 litres of water a day, but a pregnant cow will need up to 50 litres of water a day. Therefore, it's very clear that if you're going to have an economical difference between the two, it's going to be Sutton is for mutton and Carshalton is for beeves or cattle. Now, the folks from Sutton were perfectly happy to slander and besmirch the character and people and inhabitants of Epsom and Ewell. But they never said anything bad about Carshalton, fat cows besides. And this was fundamentally down to knowing which side of the bread was buttered for them. And that's literally which side of the bread was buttered. Because there was not enough water in Sutton to drive a mill to grind corn. There never was. In the Middle Ages, the mill for Sutton was in Carshalton. And there wasn't, and although the thin stretch of Thanet sand was enormously fertile, it had great reputation actually in the 18th century for barley production. They needed the mills for Carshalton. That, and they shared the same lord of the manor because it was all part of, for most of history, or a very large part of really the history that has formed us, and that is owned by the Carew family, the Lords of Beddington. And that meant that there was such a dependency towards Carshalton that it really was something of a cultural cringe because of the mills and their juicy beeves. Now, in this presentation, I have hoped to inform, educate, and hopefully entertain you a little bit about Sutton's history. But I have come, I think, to the end of this particular ramble. I do hope you've enjoyed listening to the stories. Please do comment and suggest what I should cover in future. I want to know how I can improve these talks. I'm going to be looking on in the next series, when we come on to the next bit. I'm going to start exploring the really to do with the Glorious Revolution and thinking about some of the beauties of the 17th century, some of the scandals, why a rector of Sutton got locked up or threatened with the stocks. Interestingly, Daniel Defoe had also stood in the stocks for much of the same sort of reason. There was a certain political alignment there, but we'll be talking about that. But for now, I'm going to end. I'm going to say thank you very much for listening. I do hope you've enjoyed yourselves. So long, Sutton, your history.